In this powerful story, a routine shopping trip turns into a nightmare for Tina, a black woman humiliated by a white police officer's unfounded suspicion, exposing the painful reality of racial profiling. As tensions rise and bystanders look on, Tina's resilience and dignity are put to the ultimate test. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more impactful stories that shed light on social justice issues. Tina Martinez walked into the small neighborhood grocery store with a tired but warm smile. She had worked a long shift as a nurse and wanted to pick up a few things before heading home. Tina was used to running errands here. She liked the familiarity and had developed friendships with some of the store employees. Today, however, the usual sense of comfort was missing. She could feel the wary glances from customers and the occasional gaze that lingered a little too long. Tina, a black woman in her 30s, had grown accustomed to these looks over the years, but usually brushed them off. Today, though, something felt different, heavier. Her dark skin and natural curls often made her a target for prejudiced assumptions, especially in this part of town. And although she was proud of her identity, moments like this reminded her of the silent biases she couldn't shake off. She made her way down the aisles, filling her basket with the essentials: bread, eggs, some fresh vegetables, and her favorite tea. She was in her own world, thinking about her day, when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, miss. Are you finding everything okay?" Startled, Tina turned to see a white police officer in uniform, his posture rigid, his gaze unwavering. She recognized him immediately. Officer Evan Carter was well known in the community, though not for reasons that made people feel safe. He had a reputation for being severe, especially when it came to black residents. Tina forced a polite smile, nodding to his question, even as her heart began to race. "Yes, thank you," she replied, hoping that would be the end of it. But Carter's eyes scanned her basket as if looking for something incriminating. Good. Just making sure. We've had some issues here recently," he said, his voice low, the undertone unmistakable. Tina felt her chest tighten. Issues? She was just a nurse, exhausted from work, trying to buy groceries. But something about the way he spoke suggested he had already made up his mind about her, and it wasn't in her favor. Without another word, Carter moved along, but Tina felt the eyes on her growing, their silent accusations casting an invisible weight on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, determined to finish her shopping and go home. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. Tina did her best to focus on the task at hand, placing items into her basket as she worked her way through the store, but she couldn't ignore the knot in her stomach. The glances from a few customers had turned into outright stares, and every aisle she entered seemed to carry an unspoken tension. She couldn't tell if it was because of her race or simply because Officer Carter was now following her at a distance, his eyes cold and unwavering. She paused to pick up a box of cereal when a mother with 2 children gave her a wide berth, grabbing her kids' hands as if Tina were someone to fear. Tina's cheeks flushed, but she kept her head down, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong. These were just assumptions, prejudices, whispers she had endured all her life. But today, the weight felt more crushing, as if each glance was chipping away at her dignity. Just as she was about to make her way to the checkout, she heard Carter's voice again, this time closer. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." His words echoed through the aisle, loud enough to attract attention. Tina's heart began to pound, her fingers tightening around the handle of her basket as she turned to face him. "Yes, officer," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. His gaze bore into her, appraising, suspicious, like she was hiding something dangerous. "Can you tell me what you're doing here today?" he asked, his tone sharp, each word measured. Tina blinked, taken aback by the question. She glanced at her basket, filled with the groceries she had planned to buy, and gave him a bewildered look. I'm shopping, officer. Just picking up a few things after work," she replied, the words tasting strange as if she needed to justify her right to be there. "Is something wrong?" Carter narrowed his eyes, folding his arms as he took a step closer. "Well, we've had some thefts here recently. You understand I have to be cautious. Just doing my job." His words were polite on the surface, But Tina caught the veiled hostility in his tone, the way he emphasized thefts and cautious, as if she was already guilty. "I understand, but I haven't done anything wrong," Tina said firmly, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her fear. "I have my items here, and I'm going to pay for them like everyone else." She looked around, realizing that a small crowd had gathered at the end of the aisle, their curious, judgmental faces watching the scene unfold. Her chest tightened as she realized that, once again, she was being judged by more than just her actions. Carter's lips curled into a smirk, as if her attempt to stand up for herself was an invitation. "That's what they all say, but I'm going to have to check anyway. Just a routine check." His voice was loud enough for the bystanders to hear, amplifying her shame. Tina's pulse raced as she stood there, feeling stripped of her dignity under the weight of his suspicion and the crowd's silent verdict. In that moment, Tina wasn't a nurse who had worked overtime to save lives. She wasn't a neighbor who shopped here regularly, or a friendly face to the cashiers she greeted each week. To them, to Officer Carter, she was just another suspect. As Carter's gaze held hers, Tina felt a chill settle over her. She knew, deep down, that he wouldn't let her walk away from this easily. Officer Evan Carter had been patrolling this area for years, but he had never felt truly connected to the community. For him, his work was about enforcing the law, plain and simple. Yet if he were honest, he harbored biases that he was either unwilling or unable to confront. His authority often made him feel invincible, and though he wasn't openly aggressive, his tendency to single out certain individuals was no secret. As he continued to trail Tina through the store, something in him fixated on her presence. There was no real reason to suspect her of anything, but something about her defiance, her steady gaze that met his without faltering, annoyed him. He prided himself on keeping things in order, and that order often meant a clear division of who was allowed to move freely and who was watched with suspicion. His radio crackled as a dispatcher announced a minor incident nearby, but Carter ignored it. He was locked in now, determined to prove his suspicion correct, though he couldn't articulate what had set him off. As Tina tried to make her way down another aisle, Carter intercepted her path. "Empty your bag," he demanded, his tone laced with an authority that didn't invite argument. His voice boomed, and several heads turned, their interest piqued, as the confrontation escalated. Tina's eyes widened, her fingers clutching the handle of her shopping basket a little tighter. "Excuse me?" Tina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her shock was palpable, and Carter took note, mistaking it for guilt instead of genuine disbelief. He was convinced he could see through her, see some secret agenda she didn't even possess. "Your bag," he repeated, gesturing with his hand. "Let's see what you're hiding." Tina's voice trembled as she spoke, but her words were firm. "I'm not hiding anything, officer. I'm just here to buy groceries." She held her bag up, making a show of its contents. Eggs, bread, a small bag of apples. Nothing was hidden, and certainly nothing stolen. Her belongings were entirely ordinary, as any objective eye could see, but Carter wasn't satisfied. "Mind if I take a closer look?" he asked, though the way he extended his hand wasn't really a request. Hesitantly, Tina handed over her bag, her eyes darting around the crowd, hoping to find a face that might offer help or sympathy. But most onlookers were watching in silence, a few even whispering, casting judgmental glances her way. As Carter rifled through the bag, Tina stood rigid, feeling each second stretch into an eternity. She could feel every eye on her, and her heart sank at the realization that, to them, her innocence didn't matter. In their eyes, she was already guilty, reduced to just another suspect under scrutiny. Carter held up a can of soup from her bag, turning it over as if inspecting it for some hidden contraband. Then he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "A lot of people think they can get away with things here, you know, especially when they think no one's watching." His words were cold, a thinly veiled accusation. Tina took a shaky breath, her cheeks burning with the humiliation of the moment. "Officer Carter, I haven't done anything wrong. Please, let me pay for my things and go." Her voice cracked, but she kept her gaze steady, refusing to let him see the depth of her humiliation. For a moment, Carter hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. But whatever he had seen in her expression, it wasn't enough to change his mind. He stepped back, looking her up and down with an appraising gaze that made her feel small, vulnerable. The silence around them thickened as he finally spoke. "Fine. Go pay for your items," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. But as Tina moved to walk away, he called out after her, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll be watching." His words lingered in the air, heavy with the implication that he would not let this go. Tina's steps faltered as she made her way to the register, trying to hold her head high despite the ache of humiliation in her chest. She could feel the weight of Carter's gaze on her back, along with the lingering stares of the other customers. Tina's hands shook slightly as she reached the checkout line, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. She placed her items on the conveyor belt, feeling her dignity slipping away piece by piece under Officer Carter's watchful gaze from across the store. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but Carter's words and the judgmental stares from the other customers clung to her like a dark shadow. As the cashier began to scan her items, Tina forced herself to take a deep breath, silently reminding herself that she would soon be out of there. The young woman at the register glanced up, offering a sympathetic smile, but it only made Tina's throat tighten with emotion. She managed a weak smile back, determined not to let her embarrassment show any further. But as soon as the cashier handed her the receipt, a loud voice called out, cutting through the low hum of the store. "Hold on a minute there." It was Officer Carter, his tone unyielding, tinged with something unmistakably harsh. Tina's heart sank as she turned to face him, holding her grocery bag in one hand, her knuckles white against the plastic. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice barely hiding the strain. "I think we're not done yet," he said, folding his arms and nodding toward the exit. "Security would like a word with you as well. You understand, of course." "Just routine." He added the last part with a slight smirk, as though he were speaking to a child caught sneaking an extra candy. Tina glanced over at the security desk, where a store guard looked on uncertainly, clearly reluctant, but under Carter's authoritative presence. She wanted to scream, to demand to be left alone, but the rational part of her knew that any protest would only fuel his assumptions. The weight of the moment was crushing her, but she swallowed her pride and nodded, her jaw clenched. As she approached the security desk, Tina felt Carter's presence beside her, too close for comfort. His eyes bore into her, as if daring her to resist or speak out. She could feel her strength wavering under the pressure, but somehow she held herself together, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "All right, let's see what we have here," Carter muttered as they reached the desk, his gaze flickering between her bag and her face, searching for any hint of guilt. His expression suggested that he'd already made up his mind about her, and it didn't matter what the evidence, or lack thereof, showed. Tina met his gaze, her eyes flashing with quiet defiance. "I'm not hiding anything, officer. I have every right to be here, just like everyone else." The words slipped out before she could stop herself, but once they were spoken, she felt a spark of strength returning. For a moment, Carter's expression faltered, as though he hadn't expected her to stand her ground. But it quickly shifted back to a hardened mask, and he leaned in closer, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "We'll see about that." The chill in his tone sent a shiver down her spine, but Tina refused to look away. She held her head high, her heart pounding as she prepared to endure whatever humiliation he would throw her way next. Tina stood before the security desk, her bag held tightly against her chest, as if it were a shield. Officer Carter's eyes flicked between her and the bag, his gaze narrowing with every passing second. He gestured toward her with a subtle but unmistakable signal. "Open it up," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge of authority that silenced the murmurs from the onlookers. Tina's hands shook as she unzipped the bag, carefully laying it open on the counter. She watched as Carter rifled through her belongings, turning over each item with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. His fingers brushed over the loaf of bread, the eggs, the small box of tea, each handled as if it were contraband waiting to be discovered. "There's nothing there, officer," Tina said quietly, her voice trembling but resolute. She wanted him to see her strength, but she also wanted this nightmare to end. The humiliation was suffocating, pressing down on her with each second of his needless inspection. Carter didn't respond. He continued his examination, pulling items from her bag and spreading them out on the counter, as if arranging evidence. The longer he took, the more Tina's heart hammered, the sharp stares of onlookers piercing her like knives. She felt their judgment, their whispers brushing her skin like cold winds, branding her as guilty even though she was innocent. After a painfully long moment, Carter straightened up, his expression hardening. "I'll need to search you, ma'am. Stand over here." The statement hung in the air, shocking Tina and the surrounding crowd into silence. Her eyes widened, and a cold, hollow feeling settled in her chest. This had gone beyond any realm of professionalism. It was personal. She could feel it. "Search me?" she echoed, unable to mask the tremor in her voice. "Yes," he replied, unmoved. "It's routine, ma'am. Unless you have something to hide?" Tina's pulse thundered, her anger barely contained as she met his gaze. But she knew, deep down, that resisting would only make things worse. The silence in the store was deafening as Tina moved to the spot Carter had indicated, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She tried to remind herself to stay calm, to hold her composure, but the humiliation was relentless. She could feel the stares, the way people were assessing her, judging her without knowing a thing about her life, her character. Officer Carter didn't seem to notice or care about the effect his actions were having on her. He approached her with an air of authority, his eyes cold and detached as he looked her over. "Stand with your arms out," he instructed, his voice sharp and mechanical. Tina took a shuddering breath, lifting her arms slowly, her movements stiff with suppressed rage. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being forced to endure this public degradation as if she were a criminal. She felt exposed, vulnerable, each second eroding her dignity, bit by bit. Carter began to pat her down, his touch clinical but invasive all the same. The crowd around them grew, a mix of morbid curiosity and quiet judgment on their faces. Tina caught sight of a mother pulling her child away, her gaze filled with disdain. That look hurt more than any insult. She was no thief, no danger, yet these people had already made up their minds. As Carter's hands moved lower, Tina clenched her jaw, her stomach twisting with nausea. This was beyond unprofessional, it was dehumanizing. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to speak out, knowing that any protest might make things worse. When he finally stepped back, his expression was impassive. "Nothing here," he muttered, almost disappointed. But the damage had been done. Tina felt stripped bare, her pride shattered under the weight of his needless suspicion. Carter's frustration was palpable as he glanced at the items spread out on the counter and then back at Tina, who stood rigid, her gaze steely despite the tears threatening to spill. She wanted to scream, to ask him why he was doing this, but words escaped her. In that moment, she realized that to him, her innocence didn't matter. All that mattered was proving his unfounded suspicion, even if it meant tearing her down in the process. "Are you sure you don't have anything else on you?" Carter asked, his tone icy. Sometimes people like to get creative with hiding things. The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Tina's cheeks burned with the indignity of it. "Officer, I have shown you everything I have," she replied, her voice strained but firm. "I haven't taken anything." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that seemed to cut through the air between them. For a brief second, a flicker of something like doubt crossed Carter's face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hardened stare that bordered on cruel. "Then I need you to remove your outer layers," he stated flatly, his voice devoid of empathy. The demand hit Tina like a blow to the chest. Her hands instinctively went to her jacket, clutching it protectively. "This is unnecessary," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Carter's expression was unyielding. "You can either comply, or we'll take this downtown," he replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. Tina knew what that meant. She was caught, trapped between her pride and the unbearable consequences of defiance. Slowly, with trembling hands, she removed her jacket, feeling the stares intensify, each one chipping away at her dignity. The humiliation was complete. She had never felt so powerless, so small. As she stood there, vulnerable under the unforgiving lights, she realized that this was no longer about justice. It was about dominance. Tina's jacket lay discarded on the counter, and she hugged her arms around herself, feeling exposed and humiliated beyond anything she could have imagined. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the quiet gasps and murmurs of the bystanders who watched the spectacle unfold. She felt like she was on display, her humanity stripped away, leaving only the accusation in their eyes. Carter's gaze traveled over her, searching, scrutinizing, still not satisfied. "I need you to lift your shirt," he said, the words cold and heartless. His tone suggested it was just another routine request, but to Tina, it felt like the final blow. She froze, her arms instinctively clutching her torso tighter. "No," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. She felt her chest tighten, panic rising as she tried to process the indignity of his command. "This is too far." But Carter's expression didn't waver. "Are you resisting an officer's request?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. The question hung in the air, a threat disguised as a choice, and Tina felt her heart sink. He knew she had no real option. To defy him here would mean an escalation she couldn't afford. Hands shaking, Tina closed her eyes for a moment, gathering what little resolve she had left. The humiliation was a tangible weight pressing down on her, but she forced herself to comply, lifting her shirt slightly, just enough to show there was nothing hidden. Her cheeks burned with shame as she fought back tears, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break entirely. "See?" she said, her voice strained, her gaze fixed somewhere distant, away from his prying eyes. "There's nothing." Carter's silence was his only response. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stepped back, but the damage was done. Tina felt hollow, stripped of every ounce of pride she once held. The bystanders murmured among themselves, some casting sympathetic glances her way, others merely gawking, their curiosity outweighing their empathy. Tina glanced around, meeting a few sympathetic faces, but most people averted their eyes, unwilling to confront the reality of what they'd just witnessed. The weight of her humiliation was nearly unbearable, pressing down on her like a storm cloud that refused to lift. Carter, seeming unfazed by the toll his actions had taken on her, simply straightened up, his face set in a mask of indifference. "Next time, I suggest you think twice before acting suspiciously," he muttered, his voice so low it was nearly drowned by the murmur of the crowd. Tina bit her lip, a surge of anger bubbling up inside her. She wanted to shout, to scream at him, to demand why he had treated her this way when she had done absolutely nothing wrong. But the words caught in her throat, choked by the overwhelming sense of helplessness and humiliation that had swallowed her whole. As she began to gather her things, her hands still trembling, the store manager, Nancy Holt, approached them. Nancy's face was drawn, her expression conflicted. She was well aware of Carter's reputation, but intervening felt risky. Nevertheless, the guilt weighed heavily on her. Nancy Holt had watched the scene unfold from a distance, her heart heavy with discomfort. She knew Officer Carter's reputation, and while she'd never seen him act so overtly hostile, she'd heard rumors. But standing up to him was a risk, one that could easily backfire on her or the store's reputation. She hesitated, glancing around at the lingering crowd, many of whom looked just as uncomfortable as she felt. Taking a deep breath, Nancy approached, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, a sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence. She placed a gentle hand on Tina's shoulder, offering her a look of sympathy. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, trying to convey a warmth that might, in some small way, lessen Tina's humiliation. Tina looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, shame, and relief at the human touch. I just want to leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, each word a struggle to force out. Nancy nodded, then turned to Officer Carter, her expression tightening. "Officer, I think that's enough. Miss Martinez is a regular here, and I can personally vouch for her character. She hasn't done anything to deserve this treatment." Carter's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Nancy. "I'm doing my job, Miss Holt. We can't afford to let theft slide, no matter who's involved," he replied, his voice hard, almost dismissive. Nancy's brows furrowed, her tone firm. "You've made your point, officer. Now please, allow her to finish her transaction and leave in peace." Her voice carried a note of finality, a thinly veiled warning that even Carter seemed to register. Reluctantly, Carter stepped back, a sneer twisting his mouth. "Fine," he muttered, though his gaze lingered on Tina with a look that promised this wasn't over. "But I'll remember this." Tina gathered her things, nodding her thanks to Nancy, though the shame still weighed heavily on her. Her sense of dignity was bruised, and even with Nancy's intervention, she felt the unspoken judgment from the crowd, each silent stare adding to her burden. As Tina left the store, she felt like she was walking in a daze, her mind racing, heart pounding, and shame mingling with anger that simmered just beneath the surface. The cold evening air hit her face, a harsh reminder of the nightmare she'd just endured. She wanted to cry, to release the emotions twisting painfully inside her, but she forced herself to keep walking, each step a struggle. Once in the quiet of her car, Tina leaned her head against the steering wheel, her breath shallow, eyes shut tight as she fought back the tears. She was so tired. Tired of proving her worth, her innocence, her right to exist without being treated like a criminal. She thought of her late mother, who had always told her to keep her head high, to never let anyone strip her of her pride or her worth. But today she felt that lesson slipping away, her resilience worn thin. As she sat there, breathing deeply, she replayed the scene in her mind. Every word, every stare, every accusation echoing painfully. Carter's sneer, his authoritative tone, his unfounded assumptions all pressed on her like an open wound. But as the anger built, so did a sense of resolve. "I'm not going to let this break me," she whispered to herself, clenching her hands into fists. She didn't know what action to take yet, but she knew one thing. Carter would not rob her of her dignity, nor her right to live without fear. This moment, painful as it was, would not define her. With one final steadying breath, Tina started her car and drove away, determined to reclaim her voice, no matter how hard it would be. A few days passed, but the memory of that day lingered, gnawing at Tina's mind. Word had spread quickly, and whispers floated around town. Some looked at her with pity, others with discomfort. She tried to ignore it, but each glance reminded her of that encounter, of how Carter had stripped away her dignity in front of everyone. At work, one of her co-workers, Benji Thomas, approached her in the break room. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an easy smile, someone Tina had worked with for years. He had been a quiet source of comfort since her early days on the job, a dependable friend she could always count on. "Hey, Tina," he greeted her, his voice warm but cautious. I heard what happened at the store. Are you okay?" Tina forced a small smile, though her eyes betrayed the strain she felt. "I'm managing," she replied, shrugging in an attempt to appear unfazed. But Benji knew her too well. He saw the flicker of pain in her gaze, the weight of something unresolved. "Listen, what that cop did, that was messed up," Benji said, his tone hardening. "He had no right to treat you that way. Have you thought about doing something? Filing a complaint?" Tina's shoulders sagged, her earlier resolve wavering. "I don't know, Benji. What if they don't believe me? People saw what happened, but will they care enough to help? It feels like a fight I can't win." Benji placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression fierce. "I'll back you up, and I'm sure others would too. You don't have to go through this alone, Tina. What happened was wrong, and you deserve justice." For the first time since that day, Tina felt a spark of hope, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this burden on her own. Bolstered by Benji's support, Tina felt a renewed strength bubbling up within her. She had always avoided confrontation, preferring to keep peace wherever she could, but Carter's actions had crossed a line she couldn't ignore. With Benji by her side, she knew she could stand up for herself in a way that might protect others from facing the same indignity. That evening, Tina and Benji arranged to meet at a local diner to discuss their next steps. As they sat across from each other, Tina felt the heaviness of the past few days slowly lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose. Benji pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "I've got a friend who works in civil rights," he said, glancing at Tina. "She's good at this stuff, knows the system inside out. I think she'd be willing to help." Tina's eyes widened in gratitude, a wave of relief washing over her. "Thank you, Benji. I can't tell you how much this means to me. I was starting to feel so powerless." Benji gave her a reassuring smile. "You're not powerless, Tina. Carter abused his authority, and he needs to be held accountable. You've got people who believe in you, and we're not going to let him get away with it." They spent the next hour laying out a plan, each detail sharpening Tina's resolve. Benji's friend would help them draft a formal complaint, and they'd reach out to others who had witnessed the incident. By the end of the evening, Tina felt a strange sense of peace, as if the cracks that Carter had tried to create in her spirit were slowly beginning to mend. As she left the diner, she looked up at the sky, feeling a newfound determination settling within her. She wasn't going to back down. The following day, Tina and Benji met with Alicia Monroe, a civil rights lawyer with a passion for justice and a reputation for taking on difficult cases. Alicia listened intently as Tina recounted the events at the store, her voice steady yet laced with the pain of reliving the experience. Benji added his perspective, emphasizing how Carter's behavior had humiliated and wrongfully targeted Tina. When Tina finished, Alicia leaned back, a thoughtful look on her face. "What Carter did was beyond a simple misunderstanding," she said, her tone sharp. "This was a clear case of racial profiling, and he used his authority to intimidate and degrade you in a public space. We have a case here, Tina." Tina felt a swell of validation she hadn't expected. Hearing Alicia's assessment gave weight to the hurt she had been carrying, as though someone had finally recognized the truth of her experience. "So, what's the first step?" she asked, her voice hesitant but eager. Alicia smiled reassuringly. "We'll start with the store's security footage. It's essential evidence that can back up your story. If we can get our hands on it, we'll have a solid foundation to press charges against Officer Carter for misconduct." Benji nodded in agreement. The store manager, Nancy, seemed uncomfortable with Carter's actions. "She might be willing to help us access the footage," he suggested. Tina took a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. "Thank you both," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "This feels like the first real step toward something better." Alicia patted her hand. "You're brave, Tina. Carter's actions were wrong, and by taking this stand, you're helping to make sure he won't do this to anyone else." Together, they left the office with a shared resolve, ready to uncover the truth and hold Carter accountable for his actions. After a few tense days of waiting, Tina received a call from Nancy, the store manager. "Tina, I wanted you to know. I've decided to release the footage to you and your lawyer. What Carter did was wrong, and people should see the truth." Nancy's voice trembled slightly, a mix of guilt and resolve. Relief flooded through Tina. "Thank you, Nancy. I can't tell you how much this means to me." With the footage, she knew they had a fighting chance to prove Carter's misconduct. Alicia wasted no time, reviewing the footage in detail with Tina and Benji by her side. The footage clearly showed Carter approaching Tina without cause, the public pat-down, and the increasingly invasive search. Each scene was more harrowing than the last, Tina watching herself endure the degrading experience she'd worked so hard to bury. After an intense review session, Alicia turned to Tina. "This is undeniable evidence, Tina. His actions are on full display, and this footage will hold up in court." But as she watched Carter's actions again, Tina's mind swam with questions. She felt an overwhelming sadness that extended beyond her own experience. How many others had he treated like this, convinced of his power and untouchability? She realized now that Carter's behavior wasn't just about her, it was about an ingrained system that allowed people like him to act with impunity. The thought stirred a new resolve within her, a mission bigger than just clearing her own name. She wanted change, not just for herself, but for every person who had been made to feel powerless. Alicia moved swiftly, filing an official complaint and submitting the footage as evidence. Local media caught wind of the story, and soon Tina's experience was splashed across news stations and social media, sparking conversations about racial profiling and police accountability. As the story gained traction, the community's reaction was divided. Some demanded justice for Tina, while others questioned her motives, unwilling to believe a police officer could abuse his power so blatantly. Under pressure, the police department held a press conference, with Officer Carter reluctantly standing before a room full of reporters. He appeared uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced with a noticeable tension. His superiors had insisted he issue a public apology to appease the growing backlash, but his expression revealed he wasn't convinced of his own guilt. Miss Martinez, he began stiffly, glancing at the cameras. I apologize for any discomfort you experienced during our interaction. His tone was formal, devoid of sincerity, and Tina, watching from her lawyer's office, felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't the apology she deserved. Carter continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. I was simply following protocol to ensure the safety and security of all shoppers. I meant no harm. With that, he stepped away from the podium, his words ringing hollow. Tina's stomach twisted in disappointment. It was clear he felt no remorse, and his so-called apology was nothing more than a calculated move to protect himself. But she reminded herself that this wasn't the end. The fight for accountability wasn't over. With the lackluster apology behind them, Tina, Alicia, and Benji pressed forward, filing a lawsuit against Officer Carter and the police department for racial profiling, harassment, and emotional distress. The case quickly gained momentum, rallying community members and civil rights advocates alike who were fed up with unchecked abuses of power. Tina found herself at the center of a movement, her story becoming a symbol for countless others who had suffered in silence. Alicia arranged a community meeting to discuss the importance of their case, hoping to inspire change on a larger scale. When Tina arrived, she was overwhelmed by the sight of people filling the room, many holding signs that read, "Justice for Tina," and "End racial profiling now." Alicia took the stage, addressing the crowd with passion. This is about more than one person's experience. It's about accountability, justice, and ensuring that no one else endures the humiliation Tina faced. Her words struck a chord, the audience erupting in applause. As Tina stepped up to speak, her voice wavered at first, but then grew stronger. I never wanted to be here, she began, glancing around the room. I never wanted to be the face of this fight. But what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. We deserve to be treated with respect, no matter our skin color. The crowd's energy was electric, their support emboldening her. She saw Benji's proud smile in the audience, a reminder of how far she'd come since that awful day. She was no longer a silent victim. She was a voice for change. As the trial date approached, the media coverage intensified, drawing national attention. News stations replayed clips of the security footage, discussions on racial profiling aired on talk shows, and opinion pieces filled online platforms. Tina's story had become a flashpoint for broader conversations on racism and accountability in law enforcement, bringing long-buried issues to the forefront. While some voices criticized Tina, accusing her of seeking attention or undermining the police, many more rallied behind her, sharing stories of their own painful encounters with prejudice. Tina received messages of support from strangers across the country, some reaching out to share similar experiences, others simply thanking her for her courage. For the first time, Tina felt a strange sense of purpose. She had become part of something bigger than herself, her story a catalyst for discussions that needed to happen. At the same time, the pressure weighed on her, and the responsibility was heavy. She often lay awake at night, anxiety gnawing at her as she imagined testifying in court, reliving the trauma, and standing up against Carter. But whenever she felt doubt creeping in, she thought of the people she was fighting for, people like her who had been silenced, dismissed, or humiliated. They deserved better. She deserved better. And with each passing day, she grew more determined to see this through to the end. On the eve of the trial, the community held a rally in support of Tina, filling the town square with people holding signs and chanting for justice. Tina stood on a small platform, looking out at the sea of faces. Her heart swelled with gratitude and pride as she saw familiar faces mixed with strangers who had come to support her fight. Benji stood beside her, clapping her on the back. You did this, Tina. You turned something painful into something powerful. Tina smiled, fighting back tears. We did this. I wouldn't be here without you or Alicia or everyone who stood by me. She looked out at the crowd, raising her voice so they could all hear. Thank you for being here. Thank you for standing with me. Tomorrow we face the court, but tonight we stand together. This is more than my story, it's all of ours. The crowd cheered, their voices merging into a wave of solidarity that washed over her, giving her the strength she needed. This was no longer a solo battle. It was a movement, and she was ready for whatever came next. In court, the atmosphere was tense as Alicia presented the footage, detailing every step of Officer Carter's misconduct. The jury watched in silence, their expressions somber as they absorbed the undeniable proof of Tina's humiliation. Carter, seated across from her, looked increasingly uncomfortable, his earlier bravado slipping away as the truth became unavoidable. As the closing arguments were delivered, a surprising twist emerged. Carter, pressured by the overwhelming evidence and the relentless scrutiny, asked to address Tina directly. The courtroom held its breath as he stood, facing her with a conflicted expression. I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I made assumptions about you based on things I need to confront within myself. I'm sorry, Tina. I can't change what I did, but I hope to change who I am." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone, especially Tina. Though she could see the discomfort on his face, there was a glimmer of genuine remorse. The fight for justice had changed not only her life, but had begun to change him too. When the judge ruled in her favor, awarding damages and ordering Carter's suspension, Tina felt a sense of peace. Justice had been served, but more than that, the case had sparked a shift, a crack in the walls of prejudice that might lead to real change. As she left the courtroom, surrounded by friends, supporters, and a renewed community, Tina realized that this was only the beginning. And for the first time, she felt ready to continue the journey, no longer weighed down by shame, but lifted by hope. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story that highlights the courage and resilience needed to confront injustice. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to help spread awareness and support more content that shines a light on important social issues.